A white manager proudly sits in his office, confident that he can judge the worth of any applicant within minutes, when a young black woman walks in for an interview, dressed sharply and carrying a folder full of impressive credentials. He assumes he already knows how this will go. Without giving her a fair chance, he dismisses her application. But what the manager doesn't realize is that this woman's identity will turn his world upside down. What she reveals next will leave him shocked and force him to rethink everything he thought he knew. Who is she really? And why will his decision cost him more than he ever imagined? Before we dive into this powerful story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories that challenge bias and celebrate justice. The morning was cold, and the downtown streets were alive with people rushing to start their day. In the middle of this bustling city stood a tall, sleek office building with shining glass windows that reflected the bright sunlight. It was a symbol of opportunity for some, and a reminder of challenges for others. A woman stepped inside, adjusting the collar of her navy blue blazer and clutching a folder close to her chest. Her walk was steady and confident, but there was a hint of nervousness in her eyes. She had worked hard for this moment, her resume filled with years of experience and accomplishments. Yet, deep down, she knew how often opportunities were denied to people like her. The office she entered was modern and professional, with employees moving quickly through its hallways, their attention focused on their screens and papers. The atmosphere felt tense, almost exclusive, as though only a select few truly belonged there. She was determined to prove that she could be one of them. In a corner office, a middle-aged man sat behind a large wooden desk, a stack of resumes in front of him. He leaned back in his chair, glancing at the papers with a critical eye. Over the years, he had built a reputation for being a tough but fair manager. At least, that's how he saw himself. He believed he could judge a candidate's potential within minutes and took pride in his strict, no-nonsense hiring style. As he skimmed through another resume, he paused. The qualifications were impressive. Top university, glowing recommendations, and extensive experience. But something about it didn't sit right with him. He set the paper aside with a slight frown, muttering to himself, "Let's see if this one lives up to the hype." He glanced out the large window behind him, his office offering a sweeping view of the city skyline. It was a view he often admired, a reminder of how far he had climbed the corporate ladder. He prided himself on his instincts, and today he was ready to test them once again. The woman was directed to the interview room, a simple yet intimidating space with a long wooden table and chairs. She took a deep breath before stepping inside, her heels clicking softly against the tiled floor. The man stood to greet her, offering a firm handshake and a polite but distant smile. The room felt heavy with formality as she introduced herself, her voice steady but carrying the weight of past experiences. She placed her resume on the table, neatly sliding it toward him. He glanced at it briefly before leaning back in his chair, crossing his arms as if to evaluate her even before she spoke. "So," he began, his tone professional but cold, "why don't you start by telling me what makes you think you're the right fit for this role?" She launched into a well-prepared explanation, detailing her accomplishments and the skills she had gained over the years. Her words were clear and confident, and her passion for the work shone through. But as she spoke, he barely nodded, his expression remaining neutral, almost dismissive. He interrupted her a few times, asking pointed questions that felt more like challenges than genuine curiosity. "I see a lot of experience here. But why do you think you've struggled to secure leadership roles in the past?" he asked, his tone sharp. She paused for a moment, steadying herself before responding. She explained how she had faced obstacles in environments that valued appearances over merit. Her answer was calm and professional, but he seemed unimpressed. Outside the glass walls of the interview room, a few employees passed by, their glances revealing curiosity about what was happening inside. The tension between the two was almost palpable. The man continued asking questions, his skepticism becoming more apparent with each one. His body language was closed off, arms crossed, eyes narrowed, and an occasional glance at the clock, as if he had already decided the outcome. The woman, however, didn't falter. She answered every question with poise, refusing to let his dismissive attitude shake her confidence. She had faced moments like this before, and knew how to stand her ground. When the interview finally came to an end, he stood up and offered another firm handshake. "Thank you for coming in. We'll be in touch," he said, his tone neutral but final. As she left the room, her steps were steady, but her mind was racing. She had presented her best self, but it was clear she had been judged unfairly. She could feel the weight of his assumptions, the unspoken biases that had clouded his judgment. The man sat back down at his desk, picking up her resume one last time. He glanced at it briefly before setting it aside, convinced that he had made the right decision. What he didn't realize, however, was that this encounter was far from over. This wasn't just another job interview. The woman had a story and an identity that would soon change everything he thought he knew. The real challenge was just beginning, for both of them. The sound of the office door clicking shut echoed faintly as she walked out of the interview room, her heart pounding in her chest. The polite but dismissive tone of the manager's parting words rang in her ears. "We'll be in touch." It wasn't the first time she had encountered such behavior, but it still stung. Inside the interview room, the manager leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen on the wooden table. He looked at her resume, then set it aside without giving it a second glance. For him, the decision had already been made. But the story wasn't over. Minutes earlier, when she first walked into the room, she had been greeted with a cold, professional handshake. The manager barely looked at her, and the air felt heavy with unspoken judgment. "Take a seat," he said, motioning to the chair across the table. The woman sat down, carefully placing her resume in front of him. "Thank you for giving me the opportunity to interview today," she began, her voice steady but warm. The manager glanced briefly at her resume before folding his hands on the table. "Your background looks interesting," he said, his tone neither enthusiastic nor encouraging. "But I have to say, I'm not sure if your previous roles align with what we're looking for here." Her heart sank for a moment, but she kept her composure. "I understand," she replied. "However, if you take a closer look, you'll see that my experience directly aligns with the responsibilities outlined in the job description." The manager raised an eyebrow, leaning back in his chair. "I did notice some relevant experience, but you've mostly worked at smaller companies, haven't you?" His words carried an undertone of dismissal, as though her achievements were less valid because they didn't come from larger, more established organizations. "Yes, I've worked at smaller companies," she said, her tone calm and measured. "But that allowed me to take on multiple responsibilities, which I believe would be an asset for this role." The manager interrupted her mid-sentence. "I'm not saying smaller companies are bad," he said, his voice carrying a hint of condescension. "But you'll find things are different here. It's a much faster-paced environment, and we need someone who can handle that." She smiled politely, refusing to let his tone unnerve her. "I've thrived in fast-paced environments before. In fact, one of my previous roles required me to lead a team of 10 on a tight deadline. We delivered the project ahead of schedule, under budget, and received recognition from senior leadership." Her response was professional and confident, But the manager didn't seem impressed. He flipped through her resume half-heartedly before setting it down again. "Let me ask you this," he said, leaning forward. "Why do you think you've struggled to land a leadership position at larger companies?" The question hung in the air for a moment, sharp and pointed. She took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "I wouldn't say I've struggled. I've made strategic career moves to build a strong foundation of skills. But I'm aware that biases in hiring can sometimes play a role, which is why I work hard to let my qualifications and results speak for themselves." Her response was calm but firm, and for the first time the manager hesitated. The words "biases in hiring" seemed to catch him off guard, though he quickly recovered. "Well," he said, clearing his throat, "we're looking for someone who fits the company culture. It's not just about qualifications. It's about compatibility." The tension in the room was palpable. Outside the glass walls, a few employees passed by, their curious glances revealing that they had noticed the uncomfortable atmosphere inside. The manager's tone became more clipped as he continued. "Are you sure this is the right fit for you? It's a demanding role, and we've had candidates with more relevant experience." She straightened her posture, her calm demeanor unwavering. "I am sure," she said firmly. "I've read the job description thoroughly, and I know I have the skills and experience to excel in this role. I've overcome challenges before, and I'm confident I can do the same here." But the manager wasn't convinced. He glanced at the clock on the wall, then back at her. His mind was already made up, and it showed. Finally, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "I just don't think you're what we're looking for," he said bluntly, his tone leaving no room for interpretation. She froze for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. But then she reached into her bag and pulled out a document. Her hands were steady as she placed it on the table in front of him. "I understand," she said, her voice calm but carrying a quiet strength. "But before you make a final decision, I think you should take a look at this." The manager's eyes narrowed as he stared at the document. For the first time during the interview, he looked visibly unsettled. The room grew silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. The manager hesitated before reaching for the document. His curiosity piqued despite himself. Outside the room, employees exchanged glances, sensing that something significant was unfolding behind the glass walls. As he began to read, his expression shifted. The confident, dismissive demeanor he had maintained throughout the interview started to crack. Whatever was in that document had clearly caught him off guard. The woman sat quietly, watching him with a calm yet determined gaze. She had held her ground through his doubts and dismissive comments, and now the tables were beginning to turn. The manager's hands trembled slightly as he turned the page, his face growing pale. He looked up at her, his eyes wide with disbelief. "What is this?" he asked, his voice shaky. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she let the weight of the moment settle over them, knowing that everything was about to change. The document rested on the table, its presence demanding attention. The room was silent except for the faint hum of office activity outside the glass walls. The manager's confident posture had stiffened, his eyes scanning the pages with growing unease. The woman sat across from him, her demeanor calm and steady, but there was a quiet intensity in her gaze. "What is this supposed to mean?" he finally asked, his voice a mix of confusion and irritation. She leaned forward slightly, her tone firm but polite. "It's a record of my qualifications, my achievements, and my contributions in this industry. Everything I've worked for, everything I've accomplished, is outlined right there. Yet, you didn't seem to think it was worth considering." The manager shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I reviewed your resume," he said defensively. "But like I said earlier, we're looking for someone who fits the company's culture. This isn't about qualifications. It's about compatibility with our team." Her eyes didn't waver. "And what exactly makes me incompatible?" she asked, her voice calm but laced with resolve. "I meet every requirement listed in the job description. I have the experience, the skills, and the results to back it up. So, what is it, really, that makes you think I'm not a good fit?" The question hung in the air, and the tension in the room grew heavier. The manager fidgeted slightly, his fingers tapping against the table. "Look," he began, his tone more defensive now, "it's not personal. We're just looking for someone who aligns with the team's values and dynamics. It's a tough environment here, and we need someone who can handle the pressure." "I've handled plenty of pressure," she replied evenly, "and I've thrived under it. But this isn't about pressure, is it? It's about assumptions." The manager's face flushed slightly, but he didn't respond. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms in an attempt to regain control of the situation. "You're making this into something it's not," he said curtly. "I make decisions based on what's best for the company." "Do you?" she asked, her calm tone cutting through his defenses. "Because dismissing someone without giving them a fair chance doesn't seem like the best decision for anyone." The manager opened his mouth to respond, but hesitated. For the first time, his confidence seemed to falter. He glanced at the document on the table, then back at her. "You're clearly passionate about this," he said, trying to regain control of the conversation. "But passion isn't always enough in a role like this." She didn't flinch. Instead, she straightened her posture, meeting his gaze directly. "You're right. Passion alone isn't enough. But passion, combined with experience, qualifications, and results, that's more than enough. And yet, you dismissed me without giving me the chance to prove it." The power dynamic in the room began to shift. The manager, once so self-assured, now looked uneasy. He glanced out the window, avoiding her gaze, but the tension was inescapable. The woman let the silence linger for a moment before she continued. "What if I told you I'm not here just as an applicant? What if I told you there's more to this interview than you realize?" The manager's brow furrowed in confusion. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his tone guarded. She smiled faintly, but there was no humor in it. "I'm here because I was invited by your company to deliver the keynote speech at your upcoming conference, the very conference where you'll be presenting on diversity and inclusion in the workplace." The manager's face turned pale. He stared at her, his mouth slightly open, as if struggling to process what she had just said. "Keynote speech," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's right," she said. "I was asked to speak about creating equitable opportunities and breaking down biases in hiring practices." Imagine my surprise when I realized I was being interviewed by the very person responsible for leading these efforts at your company. The room felt heavier than ever, the weight of her words pressing down on him. The once commanding tone he had used throughout the interview was now replaced by silence. I didn't know," he stammered, his confidence completely shattered. "I didn't realize." "No," she interrupted, her voice firm but calm. "You didn't take the time to realize. You made assumptions about me before I even walked into this room, and those assumptions could have cost you more than just a missed opportunity. They could have cost your company its credibility." The manager shifted in his seat, his hands fidgeting nervously. His once composed demeanor was gone, replaced by a mix of embarrassment and uncertainty. Outside the room, a few employees glanced in through the glass walls, their expressions a mix of curiosity and surprise. It was clear that whatever was happening inside was unlike any interview they had witnessed before. The woman remained poised, her confidence unwavering. "This isn't just about me," she continued. "This is about every qualified candidate who's been dismissed because someone decided they didn't fit. It's about creating a workplace where merit matters more than assumptions." The manager nodded slowly. His head bowed slightly as her words began to sink in. I see your point," he said quietly, though his voice lacked the conviction it once carried. She leaned back slightly, giving him a moment to absorb the gravity of the situation, but she wasn't finished. "This isn't the last surprise I have for you," she said, her tone calm but resolute. His head shot up, his eyes wide with apprehension. "What do you mean?" She didn't answer immediately, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough to keep him on edge. "Let's just say," she said finally, "that what happens next will depend on the decisions you make moving forward. The choices you make today will determine whether this company moves toward progress or stays stuck in the past." The manager stared at her, unsure of what to say. For the first time in years, he felt completely out of control, the power in the room no longer his to wield. The room was silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. The manager sat frozen, his once confident demeanor completely shattered. Her calm declaration that she wasn't just an ordinary candidate had left him visibly shaken. But as he tried to gather his thoughts, her next revelation hit like a bolt of lightning. "I think it's time I tell you why I'm really here," she said, her voice steady but firm. She slid another document across the table toward him. The manager hesitated before picking it up, his hands trembling slightly. As he read the first line, his eyes widened in disbelief. "You're connected to the board of directors?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She nodded. "Yes, my father is one of the major investors in this company, and I've been actively involved in the company's diversity initiatives for the past few years. What you didn't realize is that this interview was part of an internal review to address complaints about your hiring practices." The color drained from the manager's face as her words sank in. He opened his mouth to respond but couldn't find the words. For a man who prided himself on his ability to control situations, this was uncharted territory. She leaned forward slightly, her gaze unwavering. "There have been numerous reports about biased decision-making in your department. Candidates have been dismissed unfairly, employees have raised concerns, and the board decided it was time to investigate. That's why I'm here, to see for myself how you handle potential hires." The manager stammered, his voice trembling. I didn't mean to. I wasn't aware. I just weren't aware," she interrupted, her tone sharp but controlled. "You've built your career on making snap judgments about people, on deciding who belongs and who doesn't, based on your own assumptions. And today, you proved exactly why those complaints exist." He sat back in his chair, his face pale, and his hands clutching the edges of the document. "I had no idea," he said weakly. "If I had known, you would have treated me differently." She finished for him. "That's exactly the problem. It shouldn't matter who I am or who I'm connected to. What should matter are my qualifications and my ability to do the job. But you didn't even give me a fair chance." The tension in the room was unbearable. The manager's mind raced as he tried to think of a way to salvage the situation. I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "I didn't mean to offend you. I was just trying to do what's best for the company." She tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "Do you really believe that dismissing qualified candidates without giving them a fair opportunity is what's best for the company? Or are you just trying to protect your own biases?" The question hung in the air, and for once, the manager had no response. She took a deep breath, her tone softening slightly as she continued. "You know, I didn't always have this confidence. There were times when I doubted myself, when I questioned whether I was good enough because of how others treated me. I've faced bias at every step of my career, but I refused to let it define me. And that's why I'm here, to make sure no one else has to go through what I've been through." The manager looked up at her, his expression a mix of shame and regret. "I didn't realize," he started, but his voice trailed off. "You didn't realize because you didn't want to," she said simply. "But now you don't have a choice. The board will be reviewing this incident and they'll decide what happens next." He swallowed hard, his throat dry. "The board," he repeated, his voice filled with apprehension. She nodded. "Yes, I'll be reporting everything that happened here today. And the board will determine whether you're fit to continue in your role. This isn't just about me, it's about the culture you've created in this department. The decisions you've made have real consequences, not just for the candidates you've rejected, but for the entire company." The manager's head hung low, the weight of his actions finally sinking in. He had spent years making decisions without accountability, and now, for the first time, he was being forced to confront the impact of his behavior. "I don't know what to say," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "Then maybe it's time to listen," she replied. "Listen to the people you've dismissed, the employees who've raised concerns and the voices you've ignored. Change doesn't happen by accident. It happens when people make a choice to do better." The manager nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping as the gravity of the situation overwhelmed him. He glanced at the document in his hands, the evidence of her connection to the board and her role in the diversity initiatives staring back at him. Outside the room, employees exchanged curious glances, sensing that something significant had occurred. The tension inside the interview room was palpable, but there was also a sense of clarity, as if the truth had finally come to light. As she stood to leave, she paused at the door, turning back to face him one last time. "This isn't about punishing you," she said. "It's about holding you accountable. If you're willing to change, there's a chance to make things right. But if you're not, then you have no place leading this department." The manager nodded again, his voice too weak to respond. The woman's words lingered in the manager's mind long after she left the room. He sat motionless at his desk, the document still clutched in his hand, his thoughts swirling. Her calm but firm demeanor, her undeniable qualifications, and the revelations she shared had left him shaken to his core. That same day, her report reached the company's board of directors. The following morning, an email was sent to all employees. The manager was placed under review. The board announced mandatory diversity training for all managers, emphasizing that such initiatives were non-negotiable moving forward. The manager's reputation took an immediate hit. Whispers circulated among his peers, and employees who had long endured his biases began sharing their experiences openly. He found himself confronting a truth he could no longer avoid. His decisions had fostered a toxic environment. For the first time, he was forced to question the assumptions and behaviors he had normalized for years. While the manager faced the consequences of his actions, the woman reflected on the experience. She had faced countless moments like this in her career, but this time felt different. This time, she hadn't just stood up for herself. She had taken a stand for others who had been overlooked, dismissed, or silenced. As she walked through the city streets later that day, her thoughts turned to the journey that had brought her here. She thought of the times she had doubted herself, of the moments when she had questioned whether her voice would ever be heard. But now, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She realized that every step she had taken, every challenge she had faced, had prepared her for this moment. She smiled faintly, her resolve stronger than ever. She knew her work wasn't finished. There was still so much to be done. But for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful. Back at the office, the ripple effects of her actions began to take hold. Employees, emboldened by her courage, started to speak up about their own experiences. Discussions that had once been avoided were now taking place openly. The toxic culture that had permeated the department began to shift, replaced by a sense of accountability and inclusivity. Some employees expressed their gratitude directly to her, thanking her for addressing an issue that many had been too afraid to confront. "You've given us a voice," one employee said, their words filled with sincerity. "This place already feels different because of what you did." The company implemented changes beyond the mandatory diversity training. Hiring processes were overhauled to ensure fairness and transparency. A new feedback system was introduced, allowing employees to anonymously report issues without fear of retaliation. Slowly but surely, the office began to transform into a place where everyone felt valued and respected. The woman's story resonated far beyond the walls of that office. Her willingness to confront injustice and demand accountability became an inspiration to others. It wasn't just about one interview or one manager. It was about creating a broader culture of fairness and opportunity. Her actions reminded everyone of an important truth. Prejudice thrives in silence, but it can be dismantled when people have the courage to speak out. As for the manager, he spent weeks grappling with the aftermath of his actions. The diversity training sessions were a humbling experience for him, forcing him to confront his own biases head-on. He began to understand how his decisions had impacted others and why change was necessary, not just for the company, but for himself. Though his future at the company remained uncertain, the experience served as a turning point. He realized that leadership wasn't just about results. It was about fostering an environment where everyone had an equal chance to succeed. The story's lesson was clear. The fight for justice and equality requires courage, persistence, and the willingness to hold people accountable. It also requires hope, the belief that change is possible, even in the face of adversity. For the woman, this experience wasn't just a victory. It was a reminder of the power of standing up for what's right. And for the employees who witnessed it, it was a turning point, a chance to reimagine what their workplace could be. In the end, this story wasn't just about one manager or one applicant. It was about the dangers of prejudice and the transformative power of justice. It was a testament to the fact that change begins with individuals who refuse to accept the status quo. And as the woman looked toward the future, she knew one thing for certain. The fight for fairness was far from over, but she was ready to lead the way. As the woman left the office building, the crisp morning air greeted her, carrying with it a renewed sense of purpose. She had stood her ground, challenged injustice, and sparked the beginning of meaningful change. Inside those glass walls, the seeds of transformation had been planted, and the ripple effects of her actions would be felt far beyond that single encounter. But this story isn't just about her or the manager. It's about the courage to challenge prejudice, the determination to demand fairness, and the strength to create a better future for everyone. What would you do if you were in her shoes? Have you ever faced a similar situation where you had to stand up for yourself or others? Share your story in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like this video. share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that make a difference. Thank you for watching and for being part of a community that values justice and equality. Stay tuned for our next story, one that will inspire, challenge, and remind us all of the power of doing what's right. See you next time.